Hello, I'm Sebastian Michael, and today we do not have a sonnet that we'll be looking at. This is Saturday's sonnet, but in today's episode number 12, we are not actually going to be looking at one specific sonnet. Instead, what we are going to do is we're going to have a look back over the 77 sonnets we've covered so far, because we are now at the midpoint in our series. There are 154 sonnets that we have written by William Shakespeare. We don't know whether he wrote any more that we don't have, but we certainly have this collection of 154. And as part of this weekly video blog and podcast, I have discussed one now for a total of 11 weeks, therefore 7 times 7. And that means we've now covered 77, and 77 is half of 154, and that's why we're at the midpoint. So where are we at, and how did we get here? We noted two extraneous facts that are not in the sonnets themselves, that we just know about the sonnets. They're evidence that they are recorded in the history books, and I think they help us to understand what the sonnets are and where they belong. And we are going to talk very little about extraneous facts, but I think it's worth putting them almost as hooks upon which we hang the rest. And these facts are that we know, pretty certain, they're not really disputed, that the sonnets were first published in 1609. There's big debate about whether he knew that they were being published, whether he authorized the publication or not, whether he wanted them published in this sequence or not. What we know is they were first published in 1609 at a time when Shakespeare was 45. But we also have published versions of sonnets 138, 138 and 144, two sonnets we haven't got yet, which first appeared in 1599, so quite a bit earlier, 10 years earlier. And we also know, because this is also recorded, that they were first mentioned as Shakespeare's sugared sonnets that are circulating amongst his friends as early as 1598. And in 1598, William Shakespeare is 34 years old. So this will be useful for us to remember and to know that when these sonnets first are mentioned, which means when other people know about them, he is at most in his mid-30s, and this will come in very handy for us at some point. Let that be all that needs to be said about this. These are the extraneous facts. Then we have a premise. The premise that we set was that there is a story to these sonnets, a story that these sonnets chart. No way am I suggesting that Shakespeare set out to write a story. In fact, the opposite. I think what is clear from these sonnets, what I believe these sonnets do, is chart a story that unfolds in Shakespeare's own life. I believe that they are not a random collection of poems. I believe that they are not an exercise in poetry writing. There's very, very strong evidence in the words to suggest that they are what unfolds for real in real William Shakespeare's life with these other characters that appear in these sonnets. And that leads me straight away to the next most important premise, and the kind of thing on which everything else hinges as well, which is that we go by what the words tell us and nothing else. This is why I mentioned these extraneous facts beforehand. They are things we know, they are just facts that we can accept. And then we have the words, and we have nothing else other than the words, because everything else is actually conjecture. We really only know what the words tell us. Everything else we have to make up, or we have to connect dots that may or may not be connected in a certain way. Everything that we read into these sonnets is, to a greater or lesser extent, interpretation, is therefore conjecture. What isn't conjecture, though, is the words. We have the words, and there is very little dispute about them. And what we also ticked off as taken for granted and taken as read and absolutely indisputable as far as I'm concerned is that Shakespeare is a real person, he's a real man, he writes his own writing, he writes his own poetry, he writes his own plays. I have no time and no patience for the theories that propagate that Shakespeare was not in fact Shakespeare and plays or the sonnets were written by somebody else. I think that's absolute nonsense, and I will happily tell you why if you ask me, but not in this particular blog. That's just the premise. The premise is we have the words, we go by the words only and what the words tell us, and we'll see what we find out from the words. And then we delved into our sonnets, and we started at the beginning. This is another thing that maybe I should also quickly just state, that I have accepted for the time being anyway, that the story unfolds essentially in the sequence that the sonnets are published. The fact that these sonnets are published in this particular sequence does not mean or prove that the story unfolds in this sequence. There is a possibility that some of them got jumbled up, there's a possibility that some of them got sorted, but we don't know. And when we don't know certain things, I believe it's reasonable and sensible to go with what we have and to go with the most likely situation or scenario, or the most likely set of circumstances, because I believe that in the absence of certainty, likelihood is our friend. And since we have absolutely no evidence to the contrary at this point anyway, and nothing has emerged from the sonnets yet that suggests otherwise, I am simply accepting the sonnets in the sequence that we have them. Little bracket there, Shakespeare is alive when these sonnets are published. We know this for certain. And we also know that Shakespeare is quite ready to go to court. He's quite litigious. He will not simply stand by when he feels wronged. There are plenty of documents that suggest that he'll go to court over certain things. We have no evidence that he ever went to court over the publication of these sonnets or disputed either his authorship or criticised or queried the publication format or the sequence in which they were published. And so that means since we don't have any evidence to the contrary, I think it is sensible, for the time being at any rate, to accept the sequence that exists, that we have, the generally published sequence. And so we delved into these sonnets, and we found ourselves in what generally is referred to, and what I'm also calling, the procreation sonnets, the first 17. This covered 2.5 weeks in our series, because we go 7 each week. It's almost like the preamble to the story, because what happens in these sonnets, in these procreation sonnets, in the first 7 sonnets, all I, William Shakespeare, the poet, do is I tell the young man that it's time to get married. I don't tell him that I personally think he's beautiful. I just tell him that the world thinks so, and I seem to suggest that he thinks so too. And I most certainly don't tell him that I love him. I just tell him it's time to produce an heir. Otherwise, this beauty of his will disappear. So I'm acutely aware that he thinks he's beautiful, that he knows he's beautiful, that the world thinks he's beautiful. And I tell him it's time to have children. Well, specifically, it's time to have a son. Nothing else happens. And the question that immediately presents itself when you read these sonnets is, why am I doing this? What on earth prompts me, of all the people in the world, to tell some young man who clearly is good looking, who clearly knows he's good looking, and who the world thinks is good looking, that it's now time to have children? And we don't have the answer to this. It's just a question worth asking. And then we encounter the first key change, still in this procreation suite. This happened in episode 2, when all of a sudden I bring myself into the sonnets. First of all, I don't do this at all. I just talk about the young man, and then suddenly I bring myself into the sonnets. And we wondered, what happened? Why is there suddenly a key change? Does it mean anything? And if so, what does it mean? It's interesting that this should happen. And then in episode 3, we encountered our first big dramatic moment. The preamble, if that's what it is, comes to a shuddering halt. It comes to a close, a gratifying shutdown, when I, the poet, suddenly am smitten, because suddenly I asked the question, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. And suddenly I don't just talk about the young man's appearance anymore, I talk about his characteristics, that he's gracious and kind. And having previously only once or twice mentioned myself, I now bring myself into these sonnets as the author and as the person who speaks directly to this man about himself, about what this young man does to me, the writer. And I go one step further than that. I say, my verse will make you live forever. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this being the sonnet, and this gives life to thee. And this is the exact opposite of what I was saying earlier. Earlier I was saying you need to procreate, you need to produce a son. That's the only way you can live forever and the only way you can perpetuate your beauty. Otherwise your beauty and your name will both disappear. I even called that procreation, creating a son, more powerful means, stronger means to remain living forever than my barren rhyme. I called my rhyme barren. And here in 18, reversal of the powers. I now say, my verse will make you live forever. And of course the questions that this throws up are, what's changed? What's happened? If we assume, as I believe we can and have to, in the face of uncertainty, likelihood as our friend, it's far more likely that these sonnets, all of the 126 first sonnets that are addressed to a young man, sound like they are addressed to the same kind of young man. It's much more likely that they're all addressed to the same man and that something in the relationship changes than it is that I, the writer, write one batch of sonnets to one young, beautiful nobleman and another batch of sonnets to another young, beautiful nobleman who seems very similar to the first one but is a different person. That seems very unlikely to me. Therefore, the question is, what's changed? How has this relationship suddenly switched into something completely different, not just vaguely different, but completely different? What has changed the nature of the relationship, and why am I suddenly so in love? And I'm clearly in love. I state this. I even make note of the fact, two things, that you are younger than I am and you are a man. Albeit a man that looks a bit like a girl. Is also worth noting that in this entire first sort of section of the sonnets, we are very clearly, acutely made aware of the fact that our young man resembles his mother, that his father is no more, you had a father, let your son say so, and that he looks a bit like a girl, a woman's face hast thou. These are worth remembering, these are things that will help us understand who this man is, this young man. So we now have a relationship, we now have a connection, when at the beginning we have essentially a poet talking in quite generic, abstract, almost terms, certainly in generalized terms to a young man, why it is in principle a good thing to procreate, have children, to continue your lineage. Now we have a man speaking from his heart and telling another younger man that I love you. And he tells this in many different ways, in many different words, but there can be no doubt that I, the writer, am now smitten and I am in love with this young man. And then in episode 4, we had a first period of separation. Again, there is no doubt about this. The sonnets are unequivocal about that. My horse plods dullly on. I'm on my way somewhere. I don't explain what I'm doing. There are many different reasons why I could be on the road. I'm an actor, after all, in a touring company. But it's very clear that I, the writer, am away. You are somewhere else. And at this point, the connection I have with you, or at the very least the connection I feel I have with you, is such that thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. I only need to think of you for you to lift me up, for my state to soar like the lark in the morning and sing hymns at heaven's gate. That's what you do to me. And what we also get in this batch around here in episode 4 is a stronger and stronger indication that he, the young man, who at the beginning I only talk at almost, have a son, then talk to about how beautiful, how wonderful he is. I also now strongly suggest in my poetry that this love is in one way or another reciprocated. Maybe not quite in the same way as I love you, but you clearly are giving me signals or make me understand or make me at least believe that I have your love to some extent as well. There are lines such as, "Then happy I that love and am beloved, where I may not remove nor be removed, immediately before the separation happens as it happens. Presume not on thy heart, thou gavest me thine." Clearly I, the poet, am under the impression that this young man has something that he's happy, willing to give me too. We don't, at this point, really yet get any evidence that this love is necessarily physical. In fact, there is a sonnet in which I say, "Mine be thy love and thy love's use, there, women's treasure." I state almost explicitly early on that you, the young man, are pricked with something that is of no use to me. You are equipped with something that I have no use for. I make a strong suggestion, and quite a strong insinuation, that although you look a bit like a girl, you are actually a man, and that is not so useful to me. And this continues for a while. So for a while there is this ambiguity, certainly, at the very least an ambiguity as to how far has this relationship advanced. There's little ambiguity about I, the poet, being under the impression that the young man also loves me or gives me love of some description, but we don't know quite yet to what extent, what form this love has taken. And of course the question that's worth asking here is, what leads me as the writer to express that I love and am beloved? Is this based on a true experience? Has the young man really said so, or given me to understand that this is so? Or am I delusional? Am I making things up in my mind? Am I hoping that this is the case? We don't know is the answer to that, but it's worth asking the question. And on from this, while I'm away, clearly something happens, because now episodes 5 and 6, storm clouds gather over me, the poet. I am drenched in the downpour of betrayal. Why didst thou promise such a beauteous day and make me travel forth without my cloak to let base clouds or take me in my way? We know for certain that there is a relationship of some description. It puts to bed any doubt we may have had that this is just an exercise, that this is a distance thing. He is so upset about something the young man has done. The young man has clearly overstepped a mark and sorely, profoundly disappointed me, the writer. And what transpires, what we learn, is not only has this young man got off with somebody else, that's almost to be expected in a way. I mean, we're not vastly surprised about this. But what's really striking is he's done so with my love being my mistress. Bear in mind, I, the writer, I, the poet, William Shakespeare, I'm actually married in Stratford and I have children there. But nonetheless, I also have a mistress or several. And my young lover, my young man, whom I've fallen in love with, has gone and had a thing with my mistress, of all people. How could he do this to me? It is ridiculously brazen, and it tells us a lot about not only my frame network of relationships and how I conduct my personal life, I, the poet, but also this young man and this young man's emotional maturity to do a thing like that, even by our standards, even by our postmodern standards. Virtually unacceptable thing to do unless you happen to be in a group of people who have very outspokenly open relationships. But clearly here this is the case, because my reaction, William Shakespeare, the writer, my reaction is outrage and deep sore disappointment. I invoke the vocabulary of sin and disgrace. Remember when I called him gracious and kind in Sonnet 18, now I call his behaviour a disgrace. That's how deep it is. And we also get here a first hint that there are external factors now that impinge on, that eat into this relationship. Because I say, although our loves are one, there is a separable spite between us. That means that our love can no longer be as innocent and as pure and as unencumbered and untarnished as it was. But there is also here forgiveness. I forgive you. Ah, but those tears are pearl that thy love sheets, and they are rich and ransom all ill deeds, followed by a sonnet in which I tell the young man, you know, this is what happens, this is what a young man does. You are wooed by women. When women woo somebody like you, then who wouldn't succumb to them? It's the way the cookie crumbles. I forgive. I'm not quite able to forget, but I'm able to forgive. And I also make it quite clear what my priorities are in this new love triangle where there is somebody else now all of a sudden. Because I say that thou hast her, it is not all my grief. That she hath thee is of my wailing chief. I don't even mind so much that you took my mistress from me, by implication away from me. Because I loved her once. It could be said I loved her once. I clearly don't love her now, apparently. But that she had thee, that she could take you away from me, that is of my wailing chief. You are much more important to me. And so this begs the question, of course, who is this woman? And it also, because we know, we can't ignore the fact that we know that there is a batch of sonnets coming up after 126. The last batch, with the exception of the last two, are addressed to the dark lady. This dark lady. And this slightly begs the question, well, could this be our dark lady that turns up later? And we can't answer that yet because we haven't looked at the dark lady sonnets yet. There is one hint in there that points towards a possible answer, which is this: I loved. It could be said that I loved her once. I loved. There's a past tense in there, so maybe this is just a passing affair, but maybe not. We don't know. It's just a question that's worth asking again. And then we are into new relationship territory. We're into the kind of territory where something's broken. The trust and this joyous flush of love and being in love that I have has taken a serious knock. It's been drowned in rain and disappointment. And so when I'm away now, and I am away again, there is a separation, another period of separation. It's very clear from the words. I have fear for you. I fear that because I can't lock you away like my treasures, I have a fear that any vulgar thief could take you. And by saying that, I even seem to suggest that you are susceptible to this, that you yourself won't protect yourself sufficiently from being stolen by some vulgar thief. Never even mind some debonair master criminal who can sweep you off your own feet with his panache and his skills as a gentleman and lover. A vulgar thief might take you. And we come across these two sonnets that express a really quite sad and profound realization, which is that the way I love you is different to the way you love me. Even though I'm still happy to believe that you have a love for me, it's a different kind of love. It's a different character of love. It's a different quality. This is a deeply moving realization, and one that's quite devastating in its own way, when you suddenly are quite aware of the fact that, although it's not a one-way street, the nature, the quality, the character of the love I receive from you is very different to what I expend on you, what I give to you, what I offer you. And as if that weren't already quite a dramatic and quite a fascinating waveform, just about now we enter yet another phase. we go one step further, and I have argued that about now, episodes 8 and 9, we step into the middle act of the drama. Always bearing in mind this is not written as a drama, it unfolds as a drama. We're charting a drama. We're not reading something that somebody sat down and wrote as a drama. But if it were a drama, then we would now be in the middle act. In a Shakespearean tragedy, the middle act is Act 3 because there are 5 acts in total. In a contemporary drama or in a Hollywood script or in any TV drama, they're all structured in the same way. They're all structured in 3 acts. This is the point where we enter Act 2 in a 3-act drama, the middle act. The act where we have the heart and the soul and the meat of the story. Because look what happens next. What happens next is triumph and hope. We enter a whole new phase where I can say that to have you gives me cause to triumph, and not to have you, to lack you, gives me cause, reason to hope. I take a form of possession of you. And that means we are now also in the game no longer simply of love and chance and deeply felt emotion. We are now in a game of passion, power and possession, because look what comes back. We don't know what the young man says, but we know what I, the poet, do next. I step back and say, I am your slave. Of course, all I can do is wait upon you. I have no call upon your time. I will not ever presume to tell you what you can and can't do. Having just told him that having had you, I can triumph, and not having you, I can hope to have more of you. I suddenly am knocked back and say, oh, I wait upon your desire. I never would it occur to me to, even in my thoughts, control your hours of leisure. There is a game being played out. And it also tells us how far this relationship has advanced. To be able to use language like that, in order to be involved in a game of such power play and interaction and jealousy and asserting your independence, you have to have 2 people who are locked into a relationship. It's not possible otherwise. So it answers the question, do we have a real relationship? Of course we do, yes, clearly we do, otherwise there could not be this poetry about it. And then another significant step also in these 2 episodes, we're now around about the 60s, we know we are separate again, and once more this realization that what keeps me awake is my love for you. It's not your love for me. Your love, though much, is not so great. And then this incredibly personal, incredibly self-deprecating, self-effacing realization that I adorn myself with you. Sin of self-love possesseth all mine eye, and all my soul, and all my every part. And I realize that I am not as gracious, not as great as I think I am, as I want to be. I adorn myself with the beauty of your years. I make myself feel better through having you, being in love with you, through being around you. And then even building that realization into the writing of the sonnets, where I say, well, against that time when you are as I am now, and that time will obviously come, and actually quite soon, if you think of the actual age difference. If we said a moment ago that Shakespeare is in his mid-30s by the time he writes these sonnets, at the most, that means he's not really that much older. He's about 10, 12 years older than the young man, maybe 15 years older, maybe 16 at the most, one would say. Time passes very, very fast. But against you being as I am now, I can invoke the only power I have, and that is the writing of these lines. Certainly what we have here is me, the poet, baring my soul and standing naked, metaphorically naked in front of you. Whether I also stand in front of you naked for real is another matter. But I bare my myself to you. I say, this is the way things are. And then we come to episode 10, change of tone and epic rant. And what does this epic rant hint at? It hints at something being rotten in the state of England, quite generally with the way things are, but also in this batch now, in this phase we're in the relationship, there are external factors pressing in on the relationship. There is slander abroad, there are tongues wagging. The young man's reputation is being brought to the ground, either through things he is doing himself or through lies. We don't actually even know. We aren't even sure which one of the sonnets tells the truth. The one which says, it's not your fault, you are not to blame, or the one which could be interpreted as saying, it is your behavior, it is the things that you do that tarnish your reputation. What we know for certain is that the relationship is in trouble from outside factors. There are people talking. And they're not only talking about the young man, they're also talking about me. My reputation similarly is damaged. I bring forth things that are worth nothing, I suddenly say. Obviously something has happened, or somebody has said something that makes me think that what I bring forward is worth nothing, and your association with me makes you seem nothing worth. I even tell you, the young man, to dissociate yourself from me, to keep your distance, to not acknowledge me not to acknowledge you anymore in public, because the damage it does to your reputation. Crisis with external reasons, with the world being aware of what is happening, or of something that is happening. And here, obviously, the question has to be, what is it? What brings this on? How come we are suddenly so under pressure? But it started off so beautifully, so lovingly, and so private, did it not? And now it's exposed. Now what we have is exposed, and your reputation is at stake. I'm bringing you into disrepute. We are under pressure from the outside. And then a kind of redemption. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well, which thou must leave ere long. And what is it that thou perceived? It is how I am at the end of my year. I am in the autumn of my year. I am at the end of my day, in the twilight of my day. I am at the end of my fire. I am the embers of my fire. And you realize this, and that makes your love even stronger. This is an incredible turn of events, because we remember the young man as fickle and as quite assertive when it comes to his independence and being able to do what he wants to do. We remember him as the young man who, after all, nicked, if you want to invoke that word, certainly got off with the poet's mistress while I was away. And now suddenly, I, William Shakespeare the poet, have cause to say that what you see, and you see things for what they are, you see me at the end of my blossoming phase, you see me in the autumn, in the evening, as the embers of my fire, and that makes your love for me more strong. That seems to suggest a different kind of young man. It's still the same young man, of course it's the same young man, but he has obviously undergone a transformation in his own right. And why would he not? He's very young when they meet, and maybe a year or more has passed by now, because it suggests that the young man is effectively signaling or saying or making me, the poet, understand, I know what I'm loving and I love you all the more for it. Either that, or I make it all up in my head. And so we realize that this young man is going through a development. He is becoming an emotionally more mature person. And that's about as far as we've got. We are now in the middle of the sonnets, and we are right in the middle of this Act 2 of a 3-act drama, or Act 3 of a 5-act Shakespearean tragedy. It's not really a tragedy, this, though. It's more of a postmodern relationship drama with very contemporary postmodern characters, the way they conduct themselves. This is one of the observations I like to make, and I like to reiterate how very, very contemporary these people are. What do we know? What do we not know? Or what can we guess? Our whole approach has been and continues to be to go purely by the words, to take only what the words tell us and to find out from these words what's going on or what could be going on in this relationship, what Shakespeare, our poet, and these other characters, especially at this moment, the young man, could be going through. And there are some things we know for certain. They would only be not certain if the words in the poems were ambiguous. But they're not ambiguous. And so we know certain things for certain if we accept that these sonnets are real and they were written by a real person and that they reflect a real unfolding of events. And then we know certain things for certain. What are they? We know that I, the poet, William Shakespeare, am writing to a young man who's very good looking, who's very young, who's at a marriageable age, but probably only just. You hear it probably in there, but we can take this for pretty certain as well. This is the time now. We also know for certain, because otherwise the sonnets don't make sense, this first batch, that he is tasked with maintaining the name of his family and the estate, the house of his family, is his burden of responsibility. He is the one on whom this rests. This is of extreme importance to his family, that he propagate, create, produce an heir. We know he's good looking, we know he thinks he's good looking, we know he has a narcissistic quality about himself because of the way the words in the poems describe him, and we know the world thinks he's good looking, and by virtue of the fact that the world knows anything about him and talks about him, we also know that he's important, he has status. He is not, much as we love him, he's not the footman, he's not the stable boy. Much as we adore the stable boy, this is not the stable boy. This is a young nobleman of status and power. There is no doubt about this. We also know, and this is a detail more than anything else, but it's an important detail that points towards an identity. We know that in this young man's life, the mother has some significance, and that he looks like her. Thou art thy mother's glass. He looks like his mother. He looks a bit like a girl, and he looks like his mother. And we also know that his father is dead. You know you had a father. Let your son say so. Not you have a father. This is a tiny detail, it seems, but it's really quite important because it makes the pool we have suggested, and for good reason, it makes the pool of possible candidates for our young man really rather fathomable. It's a small pool of young, eligible, powerful, beautiful, somewhat effeminate noblemen in England at the time who are obstinate in their refusal to marry, and he has to be obstinate in his refusal to marry, otherwise there is no need for a poet to write poems to him, several of them, more than a dozen, telling him to get on with things and produce an heir. If he were going about it now, then that would not be necessary. So we know he's obstinate in his refusal to do so. We also know from the sonnets, get a strong indication, next to certain, almost certain, I would say, arguably, that I, the poet, am not thrilled, not happy with how I am perceived by the world, by my peers. I refer to my poverty, I refer to myself as an outsider, as an outcast, somebody with an outcast state. I am in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. Maybe not always, but when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I must therefore have experience of this. There are several poems, several sonnets where I clearly indicate that I am not a celebrated poet. I may be a reasonably successful playwright, but I'm not a celebrated poet and I'm not a respected poet. My peers don't respect me. That comes through in the poets themselves. We also happen to know this from other external evidence. There are a few things that we don't know for certain, but that we can consider to know with a degree of likelihood. And remember, in the absence of certainty, likelihood is our friend. And there are a couple of things that we can't prove, but that seem pretty likely now. One of them is that at first, the relationship starts out as not a sexual relationship. It starts out as an infatuation more than anything else. I, the poet, even say that sex is not for me. Having sex with you is for women, not for me. Then gradually the sonnets become more and more explicit and suggest far more strongly, in fact more strongly than not, that I have had you, that we have had each other, that we've been together, that we have a sexual relationship. There is a progression indicated in this relationship from And why wouldn't there be? That's what happens normally, isn't it? You meet somebody, you fall in love with them, you are infatuated with them, and then things progress. There is certainly, absolutely certainly, a progression and a waveform. There is a trajectory, there is a storyline in these sonnets. It is not all at the same level. And then we also, and maybe I will conclude with this, there are a few things that we are simply aware of, that we are aware of, not because they particularly come through in the sonnets, but that are worth bearing in mind. One of the things that we said as worth bearing in mind is how violent, how direct, how physical, and how fast-living a time Shakespeare's really is. This is not something that he says explicitly, but that we ought to remind ourselves of now and then, because the sonnets make so much more sense if we remember that we live in a world without central heating, without cars, without electricity, without LED displays, without mobile phones, without internet, without penicillin, without really science as such, where any day of any year you could die at a stroke. You only have to catch a flu. Certainly if the plague hits you, you're done for. If you are suspected of being a traitor, you're done for. If somebody in a brawl pulls the dagger on you, you're done for. If the Secret Service, there is a kind of a Secret Service, we know this for certain, if they object to you and suspect you of being a Catholic or what have you, you're probably done for. A number of reasons for which you could be done for are countless. You live fast, you live intensively, and you live young. The average life expectancy at the time, this is worth bearing in mind, the average life expectancy of a male in London at this particular time is 30 years. If you make it to 52, as I, Shakespeare, the poet, do, you do really well. It's not unheard of, but you do really well. There are so many reasons for which, as a man, you could die before then. You are not blasé if you are William Shakespeare, or if you're the young man. There may be some blasé people, there may be some people who don't particularly care. But if you are a young, passionate person with ideas, with a purpose, with ambition, with something to say, you are not staid, and you're not blasé, you're not Victorian, and you're not above it all. You're right in the mix of it, because every day brings so much noise, so much smell, so much physical experience, and every day has to be lived as if it could be your last, because it very well could be your last. Also worth bearing in mind, just to keep in the back of our minds, I, the poet, William Shakespeare, I'm married with children in Stratford. I am not actually unattached, and yet I conduct this really fascinating relationship and set of relationships. And maybe just to conclude something we've already said, actually, but maybe to just bring these two thoughts together, because we've said, and we know for really certain, that the young man, young as he is, and we're talking about really young, we have to be surely talking about somebody who's in his late teens, very early 20s, thereabouts. We're talking about a young man who is of very high status, who is very much in the eye of the world, who has the attention of the world, who people know about. And we have a poet who is anything between about 12, 13, 14, maybe 15 years old, and not much more than that. There is really not much leeway upwards, considering the time frame. So I am older. I'm not actually vastly older, but I'm clearly older, and I'm clearly not yet the icon of the English language that I am today. I am an actor. You don't have a high status as an actor in England at the time, really. Not really about now, when Shakespeare and his own plays become the King's Men, a little bit later than this. I'm an actor, I have written plays, people have seen my plays, they come to my plays. I've had a publishing success with Venus and Adonis, which I've dedicated to a young man who fits our description. We'll come to this, but I am not a celebrated poet. I am not respected by my peers yet, and I am sorely in need of money. I'm sorely in need of recognition, and I'm sorely in need of appreciation. And it is worth bearing this in mind, that we have this juxtaposition, is a lovely word, we have a juxtaposition here between two very, very different people who are now, by this point, We don't know for how long this has been going on, but we can be pretty certain, it being number 77 that we've got to so far, we can be pretty certain that we are talking about at least, if not in fact, in excess of a year. Now we're in the middle, and that means we've got as many sonnets again to look forward to, and how much I look forward to sharing them with you and to talk about them when we see each other again. And so I hope, of course, that you will stay tuned, as it were. Remember, love is the power, and see you next week.